The Nile River is not merely a body of water, it is the single, pulsating artery that has sustained civilizations for 5,000 years. For the millions of people living in Egypt and Sudan, the Nile is life itself, an existential truth captured in the ancient saying, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile." But what happens when the nation holding the key to the tap decides to claim the river's power for its own future? This is the story of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, a $5 billion engineering marvel built on a foundation of national ambition, colonial resentment, and political hubris that has pushed three sovereign nations to the very brink of war. Ethiopia's rationale for the dam is rooted in stark necessity and a history of profound injustice. Ethiopia, a nation of over 100 million people, sits at the source of the Blue Nile, which contributes roughly 85% of the Nile's total flow. Yet for decades, Ethiopia, the source, has struggled with chronic energy poverty, with nearly two-thirds of its population lacking reliable access to electricity. The construction of the GERD, designed to be Africa's largest hydroelectric dam with a massive generation capacity, was Ethiopia's bold, definitive answer to this crisis. A project of national liberation intended to pull millions out of darkness and fuel rapid economic growth. It was framed not just as an infrastructure project, but as a symbolic act of renaissance. However, Ethiopia's plans ran headlong into a bitter, century-old legacy of colonial agreements that had already claimed ownership of the Nile's waters. Through treaties forged primarily between Great Britain and Egypt in the early 20th century, Egypt and Sudan were effectively granted veto power over any major water projects on the Nile upstream. Most notably, the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement allocated the vast majority of the river's flow between Egypt and Sudan, completely excluding Ethiopia from the decision-making process or any equitable share of the water. For Ethiopia, these treaties were relics of a colonial era they never accepted, and legally irrelevant to their sovereign territory. For Egypt, these treaties were a sacred, existential right. The decision to build the GERD, launched unilaterally by Ethiopia in 2011, was a direct, defiant rejection of this colonial curse and the resulting water injustice. The project was immediately framed as a matter of national sovereignty, financed primarily through domestic bonds, lottery tickets, and contributions from Ethiopian citizens, rather than relying on international lenders who might impose restrictive conditions. This reliance on Ethiopian grassroots financing was a brilliant political move, transforming the dam into a deeply personal, emotionally charged symbol of national unity and defiance against centuries of imposed water poverty. The project transcended politics. It became an act of patriotism. But the immense scale of the dam, a structure designed to hold a reservoir of 74 billion cubic meters, meant that its construction immediately triggered an existential panic in Cairo and Khartoum. For Egypt, an arid nation that receives less than an inch of rainfall annually, the Nile is the only source of water. The potential for the GERD to restrict or even briefly halt the flow of the river during the filling of its massive reservoir was perceived not as a water management issue, but as an act of war. The stage was set for a massive geopolitical blunder, where one nation's dream of prosperity was viewed by its neighbors as a catastrophic, life-threatening nightmare. The cost of the dam was not just the $5 billion spent on concrete and steel, but the incalculable cost of instability, regional division, and the threat of military confrontation.
Please leave a like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content.
As the political controversy raged, the construction of the GERD proceeded with a relentless, determined pace. The dam itself is an engineering marvel, a vast concrete wall rising hundreds of feet to harness the raw power of the Blue Nile. To achieve this, Ethiopia relied heavily on domestic contractors and, crucially, mobilized its entire population through the sale of highly publicized Renaissance bonds. These bonds, purchased by ordinary Ethiopian citizens, the diaspora, and even schoolchildren, were framed as a patriotic duty, directly tying the nation's financial fate to the project's success. This created an extraordinary pressure. The dam could not fail, because its failure would mean the financial ruin and the emotional betrayal of millions of loyal citizens. This immense internal pressure contributed to an engineering culture where the need for speed and budget constraint often superseded necessary scrutiny and international consultation. The sheer scale of the dam's reservoir, designed to be one of the largest man-made lakes in the world, brought immediate and irreversible environmental costs that were largely glossed over. The dam required the forced relocation of tens of thousands of people from the inundation area, triggering the familiar blunder of human displacement seen in other megaprojects like the Three Gorges Dam. Furthermore, the massive alteration of the river's flow and sediment load was predicted to have devastating long-term effects on the fragile ecosystems both upstream and downstream. Sediment, which naturally fertilizes the farmlands of Sudan and Egypt, would now be trapped behind the GERD, potentially starving downstream agricultural lands of vital nutrients, while simultaneously altering the river's delicate biological balance. These environmental blunders were dismissed by Addis Ababa as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of national development. But the most critical failure of this period was the collapse of diplomatic trust. While Ethiopia engaged in years of tripartite negotiations with Egypt and Sudan, these talks were doomed from the start. Egypt's position was existential. They demanded binding guarantees that their historic allocation of Nile water, enshrined in colonial treaties, would never be diminished. Ethiopia's position was equally absolute. They refused to sign any agreement that restricted their sovereign right to use the water flowing through their territory. The negotiations thus became a theater of irreconcilable differences, with the three nations unable to agree on the most fundamental issue: the speed at which the reservoir should be filled and the volume of water guaranteed to flow downstream during periods of drought. Egypt insisted on filling the reservoir slowly over a decade or more, while Ethiopia favored a much quicker time frame to realize the dam's energy benefits. The diplomatic stalemate culminated in Ethiopia's unilateral decision to begin the first phase of the reservoir filling, known as the first filling, in 2020. This act, done without a binding agreement with the downstream nations, sent shockwaves across the region. For Egypt, it was a declaration of unilateral power, a direct violation of their national security. This move confirmed their deepest fears that Ethiopia was not truly interested in equitable cooperation, but in asserting absolute control. The unilateral filling was the single greatest political blunder of the project, instantly escalating the crisis from a water dispute to a geopolitical confrontation, pushing the decades-old conflict out of the negotiation rooms and into the realm of potential military action. The $5 billion dam had succeeded in uniting the Ethiopian population, but it had also irrevocably polarized the Nile basin, creating a lasting legacy of fear and regional instability. The unilateral decision by Ethiopia to begin filling the GERD's reservoir in 2020 immediately pushed the geopolitical crisis into its most dangerous phase. For Egypt, this act was not just a violation of diplomatic norms, it was a physical encroachment on their existential security, an aggression that forced the conflict out of the negotiation rooms and onto the stage of military preparedness. Cairo's rhetoric hardened dramatically, repeatedly drawing red lines around the safety of its water supply, lines which implicitly suggested a willingness to use force if the water allocation was significantly threatened. Military analysts across the globe began to seriously contemplate the unthinkable, an open military conflict between two of Africa's most populous and powerful nations over a single water resource. Egypt's Air Force conducted highly visible exercises, and the rhetoric from both Addis Ababa and Cairo became increasingly belligerent, fueled by media outlets portraying the conflict as a definitive defense of national survival. The crisis exposed the devastating failure of regional diplomacy. The African Union, AU, the continental body tasked with resolving intra-African disputes, became centrally involved but proved utterly incapable of bridging the immense trust deficit between the three nations. Despite numerous high-level summits and mediation attempts, the AU's efforts consistently stalled, hamstrung by its own protocols and the absolute refusal of Egypt and Ethiopia to compromise on their core sovereign claims. Egypt insisted on historical water rights, while Ethiopia demanded sovereign control over a resource originating on its soil. This failure of continental leadership demonstrated that the GERD was not just an issue of water sharing, but a profound structural crisis in African governance, where old colonial treaties continued to hold more legal weight than contemporary Pan-African solidarity. With regional mechanisms paralyzed, the crisis attracted the attention of external powers, most notably the United States under the Trump administration. The U.S. viewed the burgeoning conflict as a threat to global stability and a potential opportunity to exert diplomatic influence. Washington offered to mediate the dispute, pulling the three nations into a series of highly publicized negotiations in D.C. This intervention, however, proved to be another colossal blunder. The U.S. approach was perceived by many as heavily siding with Egypt, failing to act as a neutral arbiter. The U.S. Treasury Secretary and State Department put immense pressure on Ethiopia to sign a draft agreement heavily favoring Egypt's demands regarding the filling schedule and guaranteed water volumes during drought periods. Ethiopia felt the pressure was a diplomatic coercion and ultimately walked away from the final round of D.C. negotiations, refusing to sign the U.S.-backed document. In retaliation for this defiance, the Trump administration took the unprecedented step of cutting millions of dollars in U.S. aid to Ethiopia, publicly blaming Addis Ababa for the deadlock. This move backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing Ethiopia back to the table, the aid cut solidified the Ethiopian government's narrative of external meddling and colonial overreach. It strengthened the public's resolve to see the dam completed, transforming the GERD from a national project into a defiant stand against global political pressure. The intervention, intended to bring stability, had the opposite effect. It deepened the international distrust, weakened Ethiopia's economy at a critical time, and confirmed the dam as a symbol of geopolitical resistance, ensuring the conflict would remain unresolved and dangerous. The stage was set for the final, permanent status quo of instability. Today, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam stands largely complete, a colossal permanent monument to national defiance and geopolitical fracture. Ethiopia, against immense international pressure and the explicit warnings of military conflict, successfully executed the multiple phases of the reservoir filling. The dam began generating power, fulfilling the core promise of its existence and delivering crucial electricity to millions of Ethiopians. This achievement, securing national energy independence and fulfilling a decades-old dream, is celebrated domestically as a triumph of sovereignty and engineering. Yet this national success story is simultaneously the root cause of an enduring, low-grade regional security crisis, confirming that the initial $5 billion investment was not merely in concrete and turbines, but in permanent instability. The ultimate blunder of the GERD project is that it solved one nation's power deficit by creating two others' existential threat. Despite the dam's operational status, the core issue, a binding legal agreement on the flow of the Nile during periods of prolonged drought, remains unresolved. Negotiations continue to stall, trapped in the cycle of irreconcilable differences. Egypt insists on guarantees that safeguard its historical minimum water allocation, while Ethiopia refuses to relinquish its absolute sovereignty over a resource originating on its territory. The absence of this agreement means that the security of millions of people in Sudan and Egypt is now functionally dependent on the good faith and national decisions of the Ethiopian government, with no international legal recourse should a major drought occur. This lack of resolution transforms the Nile basin into a perpetual hydropolitical pressure cooker. The primary, ongoing risk is not during the dam's normal operation, but during severe, multi-year droughts. If the Horn of Africa were to experience a prolonged dry spell, Ethiopia would be forced to choose between maintaining water levels high enough to generate electricity, thus starving downstream nations of water, or releasing water to sustain Egypt and Sudan, thus forfeiting its own power generation capacity. This choice is, by its very nature, an act of war. The GERD, therefore, acts as a massive, permanent amplifier of climate risk, turning a natural weather event into an immediate geopolitical crisis. The long-term legacy of this $5 billion blunder is the establishment of a new militarized status quo along the Nile. Both Egypt and Sudan have invested heavily in diplomatic campaigns and military readiness, knowing that their water supply is now mediated by the dam. The crisis has fundamentally realigned regional politics, forcing these nations to dedicate continuous, massive resources to what is essentially permanent security planning against the dam's operation. The environmental costs also persist. The dam has altered the sediment load, impacting agriculture and fishing downstream, while creating new ecological risks in the massive reservoir area. In the end, the GERD stands as a towering, complex artifact of hydrohegemony. It achieved its singular goal of providing power and national pride to Ethiopia, but it did so by willfully ignoring the geopolitical and environmental consequences for the entire region. The cost of this ambitious project is not just the dollars spent, but the ongoing price of regional instability, the continuous threat of military conflict, and the crippling diplomatic trust deficit that now defines the relationship between the three most powerful nations in the Nile basin. This is a final, sobering lesson that in matters of environmental necessity and regional stability, a nation's sovereign right to build must always be balanced against the shared, existential right of its neighbors to survive. Don't miss the next blunder, Drop a comment below with the next disaster we should investigate, and hit subscribe so you don't miss a single catastrophic failure. Until then, thank you for exploring with us.